Memphis air carried a particular warmth at night, the kind that wrapped itself around a man's shoulders and refused to let go. Even in October, it clung to skin and fabric alike, carrying faint notes of river water, magnolia leaves, and something older than both: memory. Dean Martin stepped out of the car and looked up at Graceland. He had been there before, of course. Everyone in entertainment eventually found their way to this white-columned palace at the edge of Elvis Presley's carefully guarded world. But tonight felt different, quieter. The mansion seemed less like a home and more like a stage waiting for someone who hadn't yet arrived. "Mr. Martin," the gate attendant asked gently. Dean gave a half-smile. "Just Dean tonight, pal." The man nodded and opened the wrought-iron gate. Graceland's long drive curved beneath trees that whispered in the late breeze. Lights glowed warm from the mansion windows, but no music floated out. That alone struck Dean as strange. Elvis Presley without music was like a cathedral without candles, structurally intact, spiritually incomplete. Dean adjusted his tie in the car mirror. He'd chosen a dark charcoal suit instead of his usual black tuxedo. This wasn't a show. It was supposed to be a quiet visit, a conversation between two men who understood fame in ways few others could. He and Elvis were not close friends, not exactly. Their lives had intersected at award shows, benefit events, late-night gatherings in Las Vegas suites filled with laughter and cigarette haze. They respected each other deeply but from parallel tracks. Dean had the Rat Pack. Elvis had Elvis. Still, Elvis had called. That alone was enough. The car rolled to a stop beneath the portico. A houseman opened the door. "Welcome back, Mr. Martin." Dean stepped out, smoothing his jacket. "Evening." Inside, Graceland smelled of polished wood and faint cologne, Elvis's cologne. Something sweet and musky, lingering like a cord held too long. The foyer lights were low, casting long shadows along the staircase banister. "Mr. Presley is finishing upstairs," the houseman said. "He asked that you make yourself comfortable." Dean nodded, sure. He wandered toward the living room. Plush furniture, heavy drapes, gold records glinting softly on the walls. The room carried a strange stillness, as if conversation had recently ended and hadn't yet resumed. Dean poured himself a small bourbon from the bar cart. He wasn't much of a drinker at others' homes, ironic, given his public persona, but tonight his hands felt restless. He sat, waited. Minutes passed. No Elvis. Dean rose and crossed to the hallway. A faint light glowed at the far end, the private wing leading toward Elvis's dressing room and bedroom suite. Dean hesitated. It wasn't his place to wander uninvited. But he knew Elvis. Elvis hated being alone before guests arrived. If he was upstairs this long, something was off. Dean set down the glass and walked down the hall. The carpet softened his steps. Portraits lined the walls, Elvis in army uniform, Elvis on stage, Elvis laughing beside friends who now lived mostly in memory. The closer Dean came to the dressing room, the more he sensed an absence rather than presence. No humming, no murmur of attendance, no rustle of fabric. The door stood slightly ajar. Dean called softly. No answer. He pushed the door. Elvis's dressing room was a shrine to transformation. Mirrors rimmed in bulbs, racks of stage suits shimmering with rhinestones, belts and scarves laid in careful rows. Yet tonight, disorder reigned. A jacket draped over a chair. Jewelry left half-sorted. A scarf fallen to the floor like a dropped ribbon. Dean stepped inside. Elvis. Still nothing. On the vanity lay an open script, or what looked like one. Dean moved closer. It wasn't a script. It was a notebook, handwritten pages, Elvis's looping, slanted handwriting. Dean skimmed a line without meaning to. Sometimes the noise never stops even when the crowd leaves. Dean blinked. He hadn't known Elvis kept journals. The air in the room felt heavier suddenly, as if words lingered there along with cologne and stage powder. Dean turned to leave, and that was when he noticed the drawer. It sat half open in the dressing table. Inside, folded paper, dozens of pieces, some yellowed, some crisp, all carefully stacked. Dean hesitated. It wasn't curiosity that moved him. It was concern, the same quiet instinct that made performers check on each other after shows, that silent fraternity of men who lived under lights too bright for ordinary life. Elvis, he called again. Nothing. Dean reached down and slid the drawer open. The top paper was a letter, not sealed, not addressed, written in the same hand as the notebook. Dean read the first line and felt something inside him drop. "Dear whoever finds this when I am finally too tired to sing." Dean swallowed. He shouldn't read it. He knew that. But the words had already entered him, like a note that once heard cannot be unheard. He read on. "I hope you understand I tried to be what they needed. The boy, the king, the miracle, but a man is smaller than the crown they give him." Dean's chest tightened. This was Elvis Presley, the icon. This was Elvis the man, alone in a room full of costumes, writing letters to a future reader he assumed would not be a friend. Dean turned the page. Another letter lay beneath, and another, each dated spanning years: Vegas, Hollywood, Army Days, tour. Confessions, doubts, loneliness no applause could fill. Dean closed his eyes briefly. He hadn't come to spy. He had come to visit a colleague, maybe share a drink, trade stories. Yet here he stood holding the private heart of a man the world believed invincible. Footsteps sounded faintly in the hall. Dean froze. The drawer still lay open. Letters in his hand. The door creaked wider. Elvis Presley stood there. He wore no stage suit, just dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar. His hair, still immaculate, cast shadows over tired eyes that held both recognition and something sharper: shock. For a moment, neither spoke. Dean felt heat rise in his face. E.I. Elvis's gaze dropped to the letters. Silence thickened. "You found those," Elvis said quietly. Not anger, not accusation, just a statement heavy with realization. Dean set the pages gently back into the drawer. "I was looking for you." Elvis leaned against the doorframe. His shoulders seemed smaller than Dean remembered, as if fame had carved pieces from him over time. "Guess you did," Elvis said. Dean stepped back. "I shouldn't have read them." Elvis watched him a long moment, then gave a faint, tired smile. "Most folks read the stage," he said. "You read the man." Dean didn't know what to say. He had played the charming rogue for decades, wit as shield, humor as armor. But here, in Elvis's private room, the performance felt obscene. "They're not for anyone," Elvis added. "Just words I couldn't sing." Dean nodded slowly. "You want me to forget?" Elvis looked past him toward the mirror, lights glowing around its edges. His reflection stared back, the king even in stillness. "No," Elvis said at last. "Now you can't." A fragile honesty hung between them, something neither had ever offered the other before. Dean moved toward the door. "I'll head back down." Elvis's voice stopped him. "Dean." He turned. Elvis gestured toward a chair. "Stay." Dean sat. Elvis crossed to the vanity and closed the drawer. His hand lingered on the wood, as if sealing away a version of himself he rarely allowed into daylight. "You ever get tired?" Elvis asked. Dean almost laughed, but didn't. "Every night after the applause." Elvis nodded. "Yeah." Silence again, but softer now. "What did you read?" Elvis asked. Dean chose honesty, enough to know you're lonelier than anyone should be. Elvis's eyes flickered. "That obvious?" "Only to someone who knows the noise," Dean said. Elvis sank into the opposite chair. For the first time, the distance between legend and man collapsed entirely. Two performers sat in a dressing room, stripped of audience, stripped of persona. "Elvis," Dean said quietly, "you don't have to carry all that alone." Elvis's mouth curved faintly. "Comes with the crown." Dean leaned forward. "Then maybe the crown's too heavy." Elvis looked at him, really looked, and something like relief crossed his face. "You're the first fella ever said that," Elvis murmured. Dean shrugged. "Most folks want the crown." "Yeah," Elvis said, "they do." He rose and crossed back to the drawer. This time, he opened it himself and lifted one letter. "I wrote this in '69, he said. "After Vegas reopened me, everyone said I was back, bigger than ever." He handed it to Dean. Dean hesitated. Elvis nodded. "Dean, read." They cheer louder now than before, but I feel farther away from them, like I'm waving from the wrong shore. Dean exhaled slowly. "Elvis," he said, "this ain't weakness, it's the cost." Elvis leaned against the vanity. "Cost of what?" Dean met his eyes. "Being loved by millions who don't know your name when you're quiet." Elvis closed his eyes briefly. "Lord," he whispered, "that's it." Outside, Graceland's night deepened. Somewhere, a car passed beyond the gates. Life continued, unaware of two icons sitting in a room confronting truths applause had long buried. Dean set the letter down. "What were you gonna do with these?" he asked. Elvis shrugged. "Nothing, they're just what's left when the music stops." Dean shook his head. "No, they're what's real when the music stops." Elvis studied him. "You always this serious?" he asked faintly. "Only when a friend needs it," Dean said. The word hung there, friend. Elvis swallowed. "I don't got many," he admitted. Dean smiled gently. "You got one tonight." Elvis's eyes shone, just briefly, before he looked away. "Stay a while," Elvis said. "No crowd, no show, just stay." Dean nodded, "Yeah." And so they did. Two men who had spent lives being larger than life sat in a dressing room beneath soft lights, sharing silence that, for the first time, didn't feel empty. Neither knew the drawer would soon change everything. Neither knew that what Dean had read, and what he now knew, would echo far beyond Graceland's gates. But for this moment, the crown lay on the table. And two men were simply human. The hours after midnight at Graceland possessed a strange stillness that few outsiders ever experienced. To the public, the mansion existed as a living monument to stardom and spectacle, but in the quiet folds of early morning it revealed something far more human: the fatigue of rooms that had hosted too much admiration and not enough ordinary life. Lamps burned low in hallways where footsteps had long ceased, and shadows rested along the carved edges of banisters like memories reluctant to leave. Dean Martin felt that stillness deeply as he sat in Elvis Presley's dressing room, the closed drawer between them now carrying a weight that neither man needed to name aloud. The conversation that followed their shared reading of Elvis's private letters did not explode into drama or confession. Instead, it unfolded with the slow gravity of recognition. Two men who had spent decades presenting polished versions of themselves to the world found, perhaps for the first time in each other's presence, the space to exist without performance. Elvis spoke not as the electrifying figure whose voice could move arenas, but as a man who had learned early that attention could be both nourishment and poison. Dean listened with a patience unusual for someone known publicly for effortless charm, and the room gradually shed its tension as Elvis described the peculiar loneliness that arrived after applause ended. He explained how every triumph seemed to enlarge expectation rather than satisfaction, how each successful return intensified the distance between the person he felt himself to be and the persona demanded by those who adored him. The letters in the drawer had been his way of reclaiming truth without witness, words addressed to no one yet desperate to be understood. Dean recognized the pattern immediately because although his own career followed a different rhythm, he too had felt the erosion of identity beneath constant entertainment. What separated them, Dean realized, was not experience but expression. Elvis internalized, Dean diffused. Elvis wrote letters never sent. Dean turned unease into humor before it could wound him. That night, however, humor felt inadequate. He told Elvis that the letters did not diminish him but revealed a rare honesty that many admired artists never reached. Elvis listened in silence, and the relief visible in his posture made Dean understand how seldom the man received affirmation unrelated to performance. They spoke until the hour deepened, and the mansion quieted further, sharing recollections of early careers, touring exhaustion, and the peculiar burden of being loved publicly yet rarely known privately. By the time Dean finally stood to leave, something fragile yet genuine had formed between them, an understanding rooted not in celebrity but in shared humanity. Elvis walked him to the foyer, the house still hushed except for distant air vents murmuring through the walls. At the front door he paused and said in a voice softer than any Dean had heard from him, "You'll forget those letters, won't you?" The question carried neither command nor distrust, only vulnerability. Dean placed a hand briefly on Elvis's shoulder and assured him that the contents of the drawer belonged to him alone, and Elvis nodded with a gratitude that needed no elaboration. They parted without ceremony, two figures returning to separate worlds before dawn, each carrying the sense that something meaningful had begun. For several weeks, nothing disturbed that fragile equilibrium. Dean returned to his engagements, and Elvis resumed his schedule of recordings and appearances. They exchanged occasional calls marked by understated warmth rather than showmanship. The drawer remained closed at Graceland, its contents undisturbed, and Elvis experienced a rare period of emotional steadiness born from the knowledge that one person beyond his inner circle had glimpsed his private truth without judgment. The trust felt precarious yet real, and he guarded it quietly. The fracture came unexpectedly, and its origin lay not in betrayal but in misunderstanding magnified by distance. It began when Dean, during a private gathering in Los Angeles attended by several performers and industry figures, spoke candidly about the emotional cost of fame. The discussion had turned reflective after midnight, alcohol loosening guardedness, and Dean described a hypothetical artist burdened by public adoration yet privately uncertain of his worth. He never mentioned Elvis by name, and he intended the story as a universal illustration rather than a specific revelation. However, listeners inevitably connected the description to the most visible figure of the era, and speculation moved faster than intention. Within days, distorted accounts of Dean's remarks circulated through entertainment circles. Some reports suggested he had spoken about Elvis's insecurities, others implied he had seen personal writings. By the time the story reached Memphis, it had acquired the shape of violation. Elvis heard fragments rather than context, phrases stripped of nuance, and the idea that his private reflections might have become discussion unsettled him profoundly. The drawer that had represented safety suddenly felt exposed, and fear, more than anger, surged through him. He confronted the issue impulsively, calling Dean late one evening with a voice taught beneath controlled politeness. Dean, unaware of the circulating distortions, answered warmly, only to encounter a barrage of questions that revealed Elvis's belief that his trust had been compromised. Dean attempted to explain that he had never disclosed specifics, but Elvis's imagination had already constructed a narrative of breach. The conversation ended unresolved, neither man fully hearing the other. Days later, when Dean attempted to visit Graceland to clarify matters in person, the gates remained closed. A staff member conveyed that Mr. Presley was unavailable indefinitely. The message contained no accusation yet conveyed finality, and Dean understood instantly that access had been withdrawn. The realization struck harder than any public rebuke could have, because exclusion signaled not professional disagreement but personal rupture. For Elvis, the decision to bar Dean arose from wounded trust rather than hostility. He retreated inward, convinced that even guarded confidences could escape into rumor. The drawer of letters became once again a private sanctuary, and he resumed isolation around his inner circle. Yet the absence of Dean's presence lingered, because the connection they had formed had been authentic enough to matter. Elvis told himself that distance was necessary, that boundaries protected dignity, but the certainty felt incomplete. Dean responded differently. He did not defend himself publicly or attempt to confront Elvis through intermediaries. Instead, he withdrew with a quiet regret that manifested not in bitterness but reflection. He replayed their conversations, recognizing how easily words spoken abstractly could be interpreted personally when attached to recognizable circumstances. He realized that intention mattered less than perception once trust entered the equation. The knowledge that Elvis believed himself betrayed wounded him deeply, because he had valued their emerging friendship without agenda. Months passed, then a year. The band remained unspoken yet firm. They occupied separate trajectories once more, their brief closeness now a memory overshadowed by misunderstanding. Occasionally, Dean considered writing to explain himself, but each attempt felt inadequate. Explanation risked sounding defensive, and he sensed Elvis needed reassurance more than argument. Meanwhile, Elvis continued performing, the public unaware that one of his few external confidences had vanished. The drawer of letters grew thicker, entries now tinged with renewed caution, reflecting the lesson he believed learned. That vulnerability shared could transform into exposure. 5 years would eventually define the distance between them, but in its early stage, the separation felt less like time and more like suspended possibility. Both men carried awareness of what had been lost, the rare recognition of another performer who understood the silent costs beneath acclaim. Neither spoke of it publicly, yet each felt the absence whenever conversation turned toward authenticity or loneliness. The crown had returned to Elvis's head, heavier than before, while Dean resumed his role as effortless entertainer, masking regret beneath wit. Graceland's gates remained closed to him, not as punishment but as symbol. Behind them, the drawer still held letters that no longer felt safe beyond its wood. Outside them, Dean continued life aware that trust, once fractured, cannot be restored by explanation alone. The night he had opened that drawer had created a bond few ever shared. The misunderstanding that followed had dissolved it just as quietly. And in the silent spaces of both their lives, the knowledge lingered that the deepest wounds between friends are rarely born of malice, but of fear that what was private has ceased to be protected. Time did not pass evenly for men whose lives were measured in appearances rather than seasons. For Dean Martin, the years following his estrangement from Elvis Presley accumulated not as clear chapters, but as overlapping performances, travel schedules, and evenings blurred by applause and departure. Yet beneath the surface continuity of his career ran a quiet awareness that something essential had altered. The absence of Graceland from his life, a place he had visited only a handful of times, should not have mattered greatly, and yet it did, because its closed gates represented not geography but a relationship interrupted before it could mature. He carried that interruption with him in subtle ways. An unspoken pause whenever someone mentioned Elvis in conversation, a shift of subject when Memphis arose, a lingering sense that he had once glimpsed a truth entrusted to him and somehow failed to protect it. Elvis, meanwhile, experienced those same years not as forward motion, but as inward retreat. The misunderstanding with Dean had reinforced a fear already rooted deep within him, that the private self could never safely coexist with the public image. He performed, recorded, and appeared as required, but the drawer in his dressing room filled steadily with new letters written in the same slanted hand, each page an attempt to reconcile admiration with isolation. Occasionally he would recall the night Dean had read those letters without judgment, and the memory carried both warmth and pain, because it represented a moment when he had allowed himself to believe that another person could know him without diminishing him. The subsequent rupture had convinced him that such belief was fragile at best, illusory at worst. 5 winters after the night of the drawer, a convergence of circumstances began to shift that long-held distance. It started with a recording session in Lowe's Angels, attended by several musicians who had worked with both men across different eras. In the course of conversation, one of them mentioned the enduring respect Dean still expressed for Elvis in private settings, describing how Dean spoke of him not as a spectacle, but as a singular artist whose emotional depth exceeded his public persona. The remark reached Elvis through a circuit of acquaintances, stripped of embellishment, and it unsettled him in an unexpected way. He had assumed Dean's silence signified indifference or defensiveness. The idea that Dean continued to regard him with unaltered admiration contradicted that narrative. At first, Elvis dismissed the information as polite exaggeration, yet similar reports followed from unrelated sources. Each account carried the same tone. Dean never spoke ill of him, never referenced their estrangement, and treated the subject of Elvis's inner life with guarded respect. The consistency of these observations began to erode Elvis's certainty that his trust had been betrayed. Doubt entered where conviction had once stood, and with it came the uncomfortable realization that he might have mistaken fear for fact. The letters in the drawer, once symbols of violated privacy, now appeared in a different light. If Dean had truly exposed them, surely the contents would have circulated with far greater detail than rumor had ever produced. This shift did not immediately lead to reconciliation, but it softened the boundary Elvis had maintained. He found himself recalling their conversations from that first night with increasing clarity, Dean's measured responses, his refusal to diminish vulnerability, the absence of mockery or condescension. Memory began to contradict assumption, and the tension between them stirred a question he had avoided for years, whether he had withdrawn too quickly from someone who had not intended harm. That question lingered unresolved until an event both mundane and transformative occurred. One afternoon in early winter, while reorganizing his dressing room, Elvis reopened the drawer that contained his letters, intending merely to sort them chronologically. As he lifted the stack, a folded page slipped free and fell to the floor. It was not his handwriting. He stared at it a long moment before recognition dawned, Dean's hand, unmistakable in its looping ease. The paper bore no envelope, no date, only a brief message written years earlier and apparently tucked unnoticed among the letters. Elvis unfolded it slowly. The note contained only a few lines, yet their impact exceeded any lengthy explanation. Dean had written that the words in the drawer revealed courage rather than weakness, and that he would guard them as carefully as he would guard a friend's voice before a performance. The message ended with a simple assurance that trust placed in him would never be treated lightly, regardless of misunderstanding or distance. Elvis read the lines repeatedly, awareness dawning that this note must have been placed there the night Dean had visited, meant perhaps as reassurance without intrusion. Its presence invalidated years of suspicion. If Dean had intended exposure, he would not have hidden such a promise within the very space Elvis considered sacred. The discovery unsettled Elvis profoundly, not because it absolved Dean alone, but because it illuminated his own haste in judgment. He sat for a long time in the quiet dressing room, note in hand, confronting the realization that fear of vulnerability had guided his reaction more than evidence. The knowledge carried both relief and regret. Relief that his private self had not been violated, regret that he had allowed mistrust to sever a connection rare enough to matter deeply. For the first time in years, the prospect of reaching out to Dean no longer felt impossible. Dean, during this same period, remained unaware that any reconsideration had begun. He continued his career with outward steadiness, yet he had never fully abandoned hope that reconciliation might someday occur. He kept no copy of the note he had left in Elvis's drawer, having written it impulsively and without expectation of response. The act itself had been sufficient, a final gesture of respect toward someone whose confidence he had valued. Still, on certain quiet evenings, he found himself wondering whether Elvis had ever discovered it, and whether its message might one day bridge the distance between them. The bridge finally formed when Elvis placed a call. The decision required days of contemplation, because pride and vulnerability rarely coexist comfortably. He rehearsed what he might say, aware that words alone could not undo years of separation. When he finally dialed Dean's number, his hand trembled slightly, an unfamiliar sensation for someone accustomed to commanding attention effortlessly. Dean answered without ceremony, his voice unchanged by time, and the sound itself dissolved much of the tension Elvis had anticipated. The conversation began cautiously, each man acknowledging the distance without assigning blame. Elvis spoke first of the note he had found, explaining how its discovery had altered his understanding of past events. Dean listened in silence before responding with quiet sincerity that the promise he had written remained true, regardless of how circumstances had unfolded. As they spoke, the weight of misunderstanding gradually lifted, replaced by a recognition that both had been shaped by the same fear, the fear that private truth might not survive exposure. They acknowledged the years lost to assumption, yet neither lingered on accusation. What mattered was the realization that the bond formed that first night had not been illusion, merely interrupted. When Elvis invited Dean to return to Graceland, the invitation carried no fanfare. It was offered simply, almost tentatively, as though testing whether time had preserved possibility. Dean accepted without hesitation, though he experienced an unexpected apprehension as the date approached. The drive through Memphis once again toward the mansion revived memories of the earlier visit, the warmth of that night, the shock of rupture that followed, the lingering uncertainty. Yet as the gates opened and the car entered the familiar drive, he sensed not return to the past but arrival at something new, shaped by distance and reflection. Elvis met him at the doorway himself, dispensing with attendance and ceremony. The greeting contained neither apology nor explanation, only the directness of two men aware that words could never fully account for what had passed. They embraced briefly, the gesture awkward only for a moment before familiarity resurfaced. Inside, Graceland appeared unchanged, yet Dean perceived a difference in atmosphere, less guarded, more lived in, as though the house itself had relaxed its vigilance. They moved eventually to the dressing room, drawn there by unspoken gravity. The drawer remained where it had always been, its wood polished by years of use. Elvis opened it and removed the stack of letters along with the folded note Dean had written. He handed the note back without comment. Dean looked at it, then at Elvis, understanding that its survival had carried the message across years neither had anticipated. He returned it gently to the drawer, acknowledging that its place remained among Elvis's writings, not as possession but as witness. The reconciliation that followed did not rely on dramatic confession. Instead, it unfolded through conversation that revisited their earlier themes with greater maturity. They spoke of how fame magnifies fear, how trust requires risk neither had fully recognized in youth, and how misunderstanding often arises from the very vulnerability it threatens. By the time evening settled over Graceland once more, the distance of 5 years had been replaced not by restored innocence, but by deeper understanding. They recognized that the bond between them had survived precisely because it had once been genuine enough to wound. As Dean prepared to leave that night, Elvis accompanied him again to the foyer, mirroring their parting years earlier. This time, however, the silence between them held no fragility. Elvis said simply that the drawer would always remain open to him, meaning not the letters themselves, but the trust they represented. Dean responded that he would honor that trust without condition, not as promise newly made, but as one proven over time. They parted with quiet certainty that reconciliation, though delayed, had been worth the years required to reach it. The years following Dean Martin's return to Graceland settled into a quieter rhythm than either man had known in earlier decades. Their reconciliation did not transform them into constant companions, for both understood too well the demands and distances inherent in their lives, yet the restored connection altered something essential in each of them. They spoke occasionally by telephone, exchanged messages carried through mutual acquaintances, and met whenever schedules allowed. But what mattered most lay beneath those interactions: the absence of doubt. The fear that had once severed trust no longer occupied the space between them, replaced instead by a steadier recognition that understanding, once earned honestly, could survive even the distortions of time. For Elvis, the knowledge that Dean had neither exposed nor trivialized his private writings restored a sense of safety he had not felt in years. For Dean, the reopened gates of Graceland signified not merely access to a place, but the quiet redemption of a friendship he had never ceased to value. Graceland itself changed subtly in those later visits. Dean noticed that Elvis seemed less encased within the persona that had defined him for so long, as though the act of recovering trust had loosened some interior tension. The dressing room remained filled with the familiar artifacts of performance, mirrors rimmed in light, stage suits shimmering with sequin precision, but the atmosphere no longer felt guarded. Elvis would occasionally open the drawer without hesitation, removing a letter to read aloud passages that he now treated less as confessions and more as reflections. The letters had begun to shift in tone over the years, evolving from private anguish towards something approaching clarity, and Dean sensed that the knowledge of a trusted witness had altered their purpose. They were no longer written into isolation alone. They existed in a space where at least one other person understood them without intrusion. On one such evening, after dinner had concluded and the mansion quieted into its habitual late-night stillness, Elvis placed a recent letter in Dean's hands. The handwriting remained the same, slanted, looping, unmistakable, but the content carried a calmness absent from earlier pages. In it, Elvis described the paradox of fame with a perspective neither defensive nor despairing. He wrote that the distance between artist and audience would always remain, yet that distance need not erase the private self if at least one person could see beyond the image. Dean read the words slowly, aware that they represented not merely personal reflection, but the culmination of years of inner negotiation. When he looked up, Elvis watched him with an expression not of anxiety but quiet expectation, as if seeking confirmation that the shift he felt within himself was visible to another. Dean responded simply that the man in the letter sounded freer than the man he had first met in that room years before. Elvis accepted the observation with a nod, neither denying nor embellishing it, and the moment settled into shared recognition that growth, though rarely dramatic, can alter a life as profoundly as any triumph. Time, however, remained indifferent to reconciliation. As years progressed, the physical toll of Elvis's relentless career and personal strains became more apparent. Dean noticed fatigue in his movements and shadows beneath his eyes that stage lighting could not conceal. Yet Elvis continued performing, driven by a combination of devotion to audience and resistance to retreat. During visits to Graceland, conversations sometimes turned toward mortality with a candor unusual for two men whose public images depended on vitality. Elvis spoke of the letters as something he intended to leave behind, not as legacy for fame, but as record of a self that had existed beneath it. He expressed no desire for publication or exposure. Rather, he regarded them as evidence that he had experienced his own life consciously rather than merely enacted it. Dean listened without attempting to persuade him otherwise, understanding that the act of writing had been its own necessity, independent of how the pages might one day be used. Their final meeting at Graceland occurred on a warm evening that seemed indistinguishable from many before it. yet memory would later render it luminous with significance. They spent hours in conversation that wandered easily between reminiscence and reflection, neither aware that this would be the last time they would sit together in that familiar dressing room. Elvis opened the drawer once more, sorting through letters accumulated across decades, and paused over several pages before selecting one. He did not hand it to Dean immediately, instead holding it as though weighing a decision long contemplated. When he finally passed it across, he explained that it contained his clearest understanding of what the letters had come to mean. Dean read in silence. The letter spoke a voice, not the singing voice that had defined Elvis publicly, but the interior voice that had persisted beneath performance. Elvis wrote that fame had often required him to amplify one while suppressing the other, yet that both were parts of the same life. He described the letters as a bridge between those selves, and he acknowledged that the presence of a trusted witness had allowed that bridge to remain intact rather than collapse under fear. The final lines expressed gratitude not for admiration, but for recognition, emphasizing that being known privately had restored balance to being known publicly. Dean finished reading with an awareness that the words constituted a farewell of sorts, though neither man named it as such. When Dean looked up, Elvis appeared uncharacteristically solemn yet at peace, as if the act of articulating this understanding had resolved something long-standing within him. He said that if anything should happen to him, the drawer and its contents should remain as they were, untouched by spectacle or interpretation. Dean responded that he would respect that wish without question, and Elvis seemed satisfied, closing the drawer gently. The conversation then shifted to lighter subjects, and the evening concluded with the same quiet ease that had marked their restored friendship. Neither spoke of endings, yet both carried the subtle sense that something essential had reached completion. News of Elvis's death reached Dean months later, sudden and disorienting despite the awareness of strain that had preceded it. The world responded with the immense grief reserved for figures whose presence had shaped collective memory, yet Dean's reaction unfolded privately, shaped by knowledge of the man beyond the icon. He traveled to Memphis not as celebrity mourner, but as friend returning to a place imbued with shared history. Graceland stood surrounded by flowers and tributes, the gates no longer barriers but conduits for public sorrow. Inside, however, the mansion retained its familiar quiet. The absence of Elvis felt not as spectacle but as stillness. Dean moved through rooms carrying echoes of past conversations until he reached the dressing room. It appeared almost unchanged, mirrors reflecting light exactly as before, stage suits arranged in silent rows. The drawer remained closed precisely as Elvis had left it. For a long moment Dean stood without touching it, honoring the boundary his friend had requested. The letters inside no longer required witness. Their author had completed the life they recorded. Yet Dean sensed that the trust embodied in that drawer extended beyond physical presence. Elvis had entrusted him not with the letters themselves, but with the understanding they contained. That private truth can coexist with public identity when safeguarded by genuine recognition. He placed a hand briefly on the wood, not opening it, acknowledging both memory and promise. The gesture carried no desire to reclaim or reinterpret what lay within. It simply affirmed continuity between past and present. The letters would remain where they belonged, part of Elvis's interior world rather than the external narrative constructed around him. Dean turned then and left the room quietly, carrying with him not pages, but the resonance of conversations that had reshaped both their lives. In the years that followed, Dean rarely spoke publicly of Elvis beyond customary respect, yet those who knew him closely sensed a particular reverence when the subject arose. He understood that his role in Elvis's life had not been to interpret or reveal, but to witness. The trust that had once fractured and later healed remained intact precisely because it had never been exploited. The drawer at Graceland remained closed to all but its creator, and in that restraint lay the fulfillment of Elvis's final request. Legacy often attaches itself to spectacle, yet the legacy shared between these two men resided elsewhere, in the quiet recognition that being known privately can redeem the burden of being known publicly. Elvis's letters remained unseen, but their existence altered the man who wrote them and the friend who understood them. Dean carried that knowledge until his own life drew toward its close, aware that the most significant aspects of fame and friendship rarely become visible to the world. They exist instead in rooms without audience, in words never performed, and in trust preserved not by proclamation but by silence. Graceland endures as a monument visited by millions, Yet somewhere within its walls rests a closed drawer containing pages that never sought attention. Those letters represent a voice distinct from the one that filled arenas, a voice that required only recognition rather than applause. Dean Martin became, for a time, the listener to that voice, and the reconciliation that followed misunderstanding affirmed a truth neither had fully grasped in youth. That fame may shape identity, but friendship, when grounded in respect, protects it. After the music ended and the crowds dispersed, what remained between them was not celebrity or rumor, but the quiet certainty that one human being had truly known another and kept that knowledge safe.